The United States is set to unveil additional security assistance for Ukraine worth $800 million. The extra military aid will be announced after President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addresses the U.S. Congress. At the same time, the International Court of Justice is to rule on Ukraine's urgent request for Russia to immediately halt its invasion. More from Washington, Lviv and Poland in just a moment. But first, a look at the Russian offensive on the ground.
Russian forces are pressing in on Ukraine's capital. Airstrikes claiming yet more lives in the city under a 35-hour curfew. At least 2 people have been killed after a residential building was hit by artillery shelling. Powerful blasts have also rocked the city of Kherson, which is 450 kilometers from the capital. Several helicopters and vehicles have been set ablaze at an airport, just a day after Moscow announced full control over the region. Russian forces have also targeted a train station in the southern city of Zaporizhzhia. That's where thousands of refugees first seek shelter after escaping besieged Mariupol. Ukrainian officials say this is the first time civilian locations have been bombed in Zaporizhzhia. Moscow continues to deny that it's targeting civilians, but Kyiv says more than 100 children have been killed so far. Around 20,000 people have managed to escape Mariupol after days of failed efforts to provide safe passage. More than 3 million people have fled Ukraine since the start of the war. Moscow has not captured any of Ukraine's 10 biggest cities since it invaded last month, seeding hope among Ukrainian officials who say the war could end sooner than expected. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says peace talks with Russia are sounding more realistic, but says more time is needed.
І працювати кожному на своєму місці, кожному, в тому числі нашим представникам, нашій делегації у переговорах з Російською Федерацією. Це важливо. Складно, але важливо, тому що будь-яка війна завершується угодою. Зустрічі тривають. Як мені доповідають, позиції на переговорах звучать вже реалістичніше. Проте ще необхідний час, щоб рішення були в інтересах саме України.
Russia's foreign minister says neutrality for Ukraine is being seriously discussed. As talks ground on between Moscow and Kyiv, the U.S. has upped the ante, announcing that President Joe Biden will visit Europe next week to shore up NATO's unity as war rages on its eastern flank.
And Simon Marks joins us live from Washington, D.C. Simon, the White House under pressure from Congress and President Zelenskyy to find new ways to help Ukraine. Can President Biden find enough middle ground to please all sides?
Look, I think that's the big question for the days ahead. I mean, certainly President Zelenskyy, when he addresses Congress in about an hour's time, is bound to renew his call for NATO to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine and renew his call for some of those surplus MiG fighter jets from countries like Poland to be conveyed to Ukraine to assist. President Biden's going to respond today, unveiling $1 billion in new expenditure on weapon systems for Ukraine, including anti-tank, anti-armor and anti-air defenses, more Javelin missiles, more Stingers that the United States is going to supply to the Ukrainian armed forces. They say they still have a means for delivering those additional weapons into the battle zone, despite the intensity of the fighting that's taking place. Of course, $1 billion is a big number, and the United States will argue that it's going substantially to bolster Ukraine's efforts to push back against this Russian military onslaught, but it continues to stop short of the demands that the Ukrainian leader has already made in addresses before Parliament in London, the Parliament in Canada yesterday, and very soon before the United States Congress as well.
Simon, whatever happens in the immediate weeks and months ahead, the U.S. and other NATO members say they have to start planning to adapt to a new reality triggered by this war. What does this new security posture entail?
Well, primarily, it entails conveying to the Russians that, as the White House puts it, the Western alliance is more united now than it has ever been before, that this Russian invasion of Ukraine has absolutely galvanized a determination by NATO to stand up to Vladimir Putin's aggression, particularly if it ends up targeting a NATO member state. But NATO also has to get ready for a new reality that will exist after this is all over, particularly if any of those peace negotiations bear fruit, a Moscow that is determined to hive off a substantial piece of Ukraine and bring it into the Kremlin's sphere of influence. Discussions underway about Moscow's demands for Ukraine to become a neutral state, and also a continuing desire by President Vladimir Putin to force NATO into retreat at precisely the time NATO is indicating that is very much not on its mind in light of the events of the last 3 weeks. So for President Biden, that visit to NATO headquarters in Brussels on March the 24th is going to be a very important moment, both in his presidency and in terms of the alliance's preparations for whatever comes next.
Well, thanks, Simon. Simon Marks in Washington, D.C.
Well, let's get back now to the situation in Ukraine. Philip Crowther joins us live now from Lviv. Philip, we've seen in Kyiv the more airstrikes, more deadly airstrikes, in fact, in recent days on residential areas, apartment blocks as well. Is this perhaps an indication that Russian ground forces aren't making the progress that they would want to as they advance on the capital?
Well, that is definitely an interpretation that US officials have, the British intelligence community as well, for example, and most military experts have also been analyzing these ground movements from Russian troops around, or rather to the northeast and to the east of the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, and that there simply have not been any significant advances on the ground for days now. The Ukrainian resistance is simply too strong. Now, that doesn't mean that there haven't been aerial attacks. We've seen pictures again today of what would appear to be an aerial attack from Russia. We haven't yet been able to independently verify that at this point, but there have been artillery strikes on residential areas, again, inside the capital city. One 12-story apartment building going up in flames with 2 victims there, without a clarification from local authorities whether those were deaths or just injuries. We can expect those attacks to continue. They're coming from a distance. Artillery fire comes from positions that are further away. These don't come from the ground troops trying to get into the city. And of course, remember that Kyiv is a city that has been preparing for this moment for a long time, during this 3-week-long invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but also already beforehand. Civilians have been getting training to be able to be ready for combat if it comes to such a thing inside the capital city. There are a lot of soldiers on the streets of the capital city as well, protecting that city. It's a fortress, according to Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko. So it's probably fair to say that there is frustration on the Russian side that this has not gone as quickly as Moscow rather had expected.
Well, as fortified as it is, Philip, 21 days into this war, Ukrainian officials are now suggesting that Moscow might even be coming to terms with its failure to quickly impose a new government in Kyiv, to perhaps decapitate the existing government, as Vladimir Putin put it. Do the ongoing peace talks present any face-saving options for Russia at all towards perhaps an exit strategy from this war?
Well, tell you what, from the Russian side, there seems to be a bit of optimism today. It's very difficult to show any optimism generally when it comes to these talks. Indeed, it might be a bit of a stretch to call them peace talks at this point. The two sides are discussing potential ceasefires, potential agreements between the two sides. But that optimism is very interesting from the Russian side. And it does come directly from the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. He says that there's a business-like spirit in these negotiations between Russians and Ukrainians. But he also says that there are discussions about the, quote, neutral status of Ukraine. Now, what that might mean would be a neutral military status, meaning that Ukraine would not be joining NATO. That has always been one of those big demands from Moscow, and that there would be no foreign military bases in Ukraine. There are many ways of interpreting the term neutrality when it comes to how countries adapt their military, the size of their militaries. Now, the Ukrainian response to that statement from Sergei Lavrov has been a little bit lukewarm, but there still seems to be something worth working with. Now, that does not mean that there aren't enormous obstacles still in the way of any kind of an peaceful agreement between these two countries. Remember that Russia has demanded the demilitarization of Ukraine. Could this neutrality be a way of interpreting that? Well, possibly. But there are other demands. The demand that Crimea be accepted as part of Russia. The demand that Ukraine also recognize the independence of the so-called separatist republics in the east. This would be a very long stretch for a country like Ukraine that is showing a lot of solidarity, a lot of national unity right now, and a lot of confidence that its armed forces could actually beat the much stronger on paper neighbor that is Russia.
All right, Philip, thank you for that update. Philip Crowther there in Lviv, Ukraine.
For now, let's take a look at what's happening live near the Polish border of Ukraine with Will Denslow. Will. Little support from NATO allies so far for a Polish call for the alliance to send an armed peace mission to Ukraine.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We've heard from the Vice Premier of Poland who says that there should be a NATO peacekeeping mission sent to Ukraine. As you mentioned, it must be protected with armed personnel. Now, this is going to be a very tough sell for NATO members, considering what we've been hearing out of NATO for the last few weeks. Of course, there was that discrepancy between Poland and the United States when it came to the transferring of MiG jets from NATO forces via Germany through to Ukraine. That was essentially blocked by Washington and amid concerns about what this could be perceived as a military escalation in the eyes of Moscow. And of course, there is that huge issue when it comes to Ukraine's no-fly zone, something that Kyiv is ardently calling for and has been calling for from Ukraine since Russia's invasion began. NATO members, again, have been unwilling to take such an action for fear this would bring NATO members into direct conflict with Russia. However, at this NATO meeting of defence ministers, we have heard as a precursor from Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General. He said that it's time for a NATO reset when it comes to its military posture in this new era. He said that they might look at things like having more forces deployed to the Eastern Front, as well as having more pre-positioned equipment as well. We have heard from Ukraine's foreign minister, who is also attending this meeting of NATO defence ministers. He is calling for more air and missile systems in place in Ukraine.
Well, Poland also looking for assistance in terms of refugees. As of the 15th of March, more than 1.8 million Ukrainians have fled to Poland.
That's absolutely right. And we're here at Przemysl train station, which is about 15 kilometers away from the border. And this train station you can see behind me is a very busy, well-populated transit point for refugees that have crossed the border and will then go elsewhere in Poland or perhaps elsewhere in Europe. And behind me, you can see buses that are being used as well as the trains to get Ukrainian refugees around the country. Here, they're provided with some humanitarian assistance when it comes to hot meals or even logistical support to help them really navigate where they need to go on their journey further into Poland. Of course, many of those that come to places like here will eventually settle in some of the major cities in Poland, be it somewhere like Krakow, be it in Warsaw as well, where more than 300,000 refugees have so far settled. And there are concerns that these major cities need greater support, as does the whole country. $1.75 billion has been allocated by the Polish government, but with refugee numbers only expected to increase, Poland is calling for more assistance. The EU has pledged a portion of $500 million to help with this humanitarian assistance. But the message from Poland's President Andrzej Duda is that he wants other European nations to do more to open up their borders to help ease the humanitarian situation for Ukrainians here in Poland.
Thanks for that. Will Denslow on the border between Poland and Ukraine.